artillery pieces. Instead of altering the guns, Bull simply redesigned the ammunition they fired.
If you picture a shell, it seems wonderfully streamlined at the front, but of course it's flat at the back. And the turbulence, there's a partial vacuum at the back end of a shell, and the sucking of air inevitably slows down the shell and limits its ultimate range. Gerald Bull had a great idea of actually designing a system by which you would bleed gas into the space at the back of the shell, so that it was no longer being, as it were, sucked back by this eternal semi-vacuum void that formed at the end.
Dr. Bull applied some of the Project HARP advances to a conventional 155mm shell. He made it thinner and more streamlined. He then added small fins as stabilizers to keep the slender shell steady inside the gun. They also helped the shells to glide farther. The new GC-45 shell was nothing short of revolutionary. By lengthening the 155mm gun barrel slightly, the shells were soon capable of flying 1.5 times farther than conventional NATO shells.
When you've increased the range of the gun, the benefit is this. You can put your own guns back where they're safer, or you can fire deeper into enemy territory. And because one gun can command more ground, you can cover the area with less number of guns.
Before long, artillery guns based on Bull's designs appeared all over the world. The Israelis used them to protect the Golan Heights. During the Iran-Iraq War, the Iraqis bought over 500 artillery cannons based on Bull's design, and they were used to devastating effect. In 1984, Bull teamed with Dr. Charles Murphy to publish a book about superguns. During his research, he became obsessed with the long-range Paris gun. He managed to get many of the secret German documents on the Paris gun project from friends at the Krupp factory. Using computers, Bull ran calculations to learn all he could from the design and wartime employment of the gun. During this time, he immersed himself in the subject of World War I. He often toured the battlefields outside his office in Brussels, Belgium, and read poetry written by soldiers during the war.
He would walk through the graveyards, reading the little crosses and reciting his poetry, sometimes on his own, sometimes with one of his sons who went with him. And he would cry, and a great many of them are marked known only unto God. There's no name, no one knows who lies there. The reason is that they were blown to pieces by artillery, the very work that he was involved in. And I really think that he did not make that jump of realizing that the pieces he was producing new little crosses on some other land. He was producing many weeping widows and mothers, as had been produced in the First World War.
When the Iran-Iraq War ended in 1988, the Iraqi military was looking to rebuild its artillery systems, and members of the Iraqi government approached Gerald Bull.
And in those conversations, he began to tell them about his life ambition, which was to prove that it would be possible to launch a satellite with a huge gun at a fraction of the cost.
No Arab country had ever launched a satellite, and the notion of an inexpensive gun system that could fire satellites into orbit appealed to Saddam Hussein. At long last, Gerald Bull thought he'd found someone who shared his vision.
With their financial backing, he set down to develop the greatest gun that anybody would ever have seen. It would have weighed 2,100 tons. Can you imagine the size of that?
Bull borrowed from his HARP gun design and opted to build the barrel in segments. In all, they would stretch 512 feet long, nearly 1.5 times the length of a soccer field. The gun would be so powerful, it could fire a 2-ton rocket-assisted shell into orbit. The Iraqis codenamed the gun Project Babylon, but there were concerns at Dr. Bull's company. Iraq was embarking on an unprecedented arms buildup.
I did disagree with Project Babylon. I said it was a dangerous project. My objection to the supergun project were political much more than scientific.
When his son convinced him that his super gun could be seen as a military weapon, Dr. Bull decided to build it discreetly. The gun was fabricated in separate parts by factories in England, Spain, Holland, and Switzerland. Many manufacturers were led to believe they were working on a petrochemical project for the Iraqis. Bull's supergun was now a secret gun.
But he didn't keep it that secret because he talked a lot. He didn't understand the dangers of loose lips sinking ships.
My dad was probably the worst secret keeper in the world. He was a very enthusiastic person. He would talk.
As word leaked that Gerald Bull was getting a second chance at his lifetime dream, pieces of the gun began to arrive in Iraq, upsetting the delicate balance of power in the Middle East.
They are two of the smartest animals on Earth. Elephants have memories that are legendary. And watch as we put some of our Finn friends through some mental and intellectual tests. On the next, Man's Heritage. Living with the Elephants and Dolphins, Deep Thinkers. Thursday on Pearl at 8.
Hong Kong 大家嘅，我哋當香港每一度地方都係我哋屋企。
喺呢排咧係最辛苦嘅，最重要係大家一齊去做就更加開心啦。
全城抗疫3連3。
How far would you dare to go? How much are you willing to suffer when the goal now is nothing less than perfection?
We are breeding a culture of surgical addicts.
I've already had my nose done twice, so I'm kind of old hat to this.
The final chapter of Science of Beauty. Thursday on Pearl at MI 930.
As a component of Project Babylon, Dr. Bull designed and built a smaller gun, nicknamed Baby Babylon, as a prototype for the larger supergun. This 40-meter-long gun was first constructed for horizontal testing. In the summer of 1989, the Iraqis installed the prototype at a secret site at Jabal Hamran, 90 miles north of Baghdad, in central Iraq. The gun was positioned along a mountainside at about 45 degrees, an angle which didn't seem appropriate for high-altitude gun research. As long as they kept funding Project Babylon, Dr. Bull agreed to assist the Iraqis with other weapons projects. These other ventures led him down a dangerous path.
My dad was a bit politically naive, and they tagged that project along. They did fund the project, okay? But meanwhile, they were asking increasing things from him.
Bull designed a number of advanced mobile artillery systems for the Iraqis that would use supergun technology. Perhaps the most ominous project Bull worked on was the long-range Iraqi Scud missile program. For Saddam Hussein, the major trouble with his Scuds was their restricted range and accuracy. Like the Paris guns of World War I, they could hit a city, but not an exact target. To carry a heavier warhead, they also needed more power.
They did ask him at one time to validate some of their work, a missile program in which they basically took some Scuds and put them together.
They needed, they felt they needed, a long-range missile. A missile that could really threaten Israel. They didn't have that. What they did have were large numbers of Russian Scuds. And they felt that if they tied enough of these Scuds together, they would change them from being a short-range missile into at least a medium-range missile. And Bull agreed with that.
Bull assisted the Iraqis with some of the mathematical calculations in their multi-stage Scud rocket program. It may have been a fateful decision. Israeli intelligence agents were following the project closely.
On at least 2 occasions, the Iraqis tried to launch one of these cobbled up, tied together missiles, and they failed. But sooner or later, they were going to be successful, and the Israelis knew that. And friends of Bull, people that Bull had known for years, who were associated with the Israeli government, and certainly some of them, in fact, were at the time members of the staff of the Israeli embassy in Paris, visited Bull in Brussels and talked with him at some length in secret meetings. Now, we don't know what happened at those meetings, but Bull's colleagues have told me that he emerged from them a very worried man. I think the Israelis realized that he was frightened and that he might stop, and they wanted to encourage that. And strange things began to happen to him. He lived in a small apartment just out of the center of Brussels. He arrived home one day and the furniture was rearranged in his apartment.
There were little gestures, you might say, nothing that would identify an assailant, but enough to unsettle him.
He did complain about a lot of these things, but not in a way to say, oh, gee, somebody's trying to warn me.
Meanwhile, Dr. Bull and the Iraqis continued to test fire the baby Babylon gun. Bull became increasingly nervous. He was drinking during the day and taking sleeping pills at night. His every move was now being watched. On the 22nd of March, 1990, his assistant dropped him off at his apartment. He was carrying $20,000 in cash. Inside, he rode the elevator to the 6th floor and stepped out into this hallway, where a killer with a silenced pistol waited in the shadows of an alcove.
Bull turned left to his apartment door, fumbled for his keys, got his keys out, and in fact had put the key in the lock. The person who had been standing in the alcove then stepped out behind him and fired 5 shots in a straight line right up his back. He died more or less instantly in a large pool of blood on the floor.
Shortly thereafter, Gerald Bull's body was discovered. His money had not been taken.
It came as a total, entire surprise, and it's a shock, and you don't believe, you go into denial for a little while. And then it just sinks in, and then you're at loss. It takes a long while to heal from that.
The Belgian police believe the assassin ran down the stairs, walked out through this back garden and into a waiting car. Most experts believe that it was a government-sponsored execution, but which government may never be known. Some believe the Iraqis no longer trusted Dr. Bull, perhaps fearful that he gave the Israelis details on the super gun or the Scud missile program. It could also have been the work of Israel's secret Mossad.
He had many enemies, international enemies. The one that makes the most sense is Israel. The visits from the Israelis fit the timetable. He himself felt that it was the Israelis who were threatening him, and the circumstantial evidence would seem to point to that, but you could never prove it.
Acting on an anonymous tip, the British Customs and Excise Department seized the final 8 sections of the supergun in November 1990. During the Persian Gulf War, Israeli concerns over the Scud missiles were borne out. The Iraqis fired their Scuds at Americans in Saudi Arabia and Israelis in Tel Aviv. After the war, United Nations inspectors raced to the sites of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction and blew up a number of biological and chemical weapons plants. When they arrived at the supergun sites, they discovered baby Babylon still intact.
There's a secondary gunfire system.
The inspectors went to great lengths to ascertain the capabilities of the supergun.
The requirement, according to the Iraqi declaration, was to fire a 600-kilogram projectile about 1,000 kilometers. That was if you look back at the work that Gerald Bull did in Harp, that's quite achievable. And with this size caliber and a rocket-assisted projectile, it could certainly push towards low Earth orbit.
These sections of the supergun barrel were found in a final staging area. The UN team determined that Project Babylon was a weapons program and destroyed the remains of the guns. Building a supergun this size may never be attempted again.
I've got a feeling that General Bull was to guns what Werner von Braun was to rockets. They really wanted to build the biggest and the best. And at the end of the day, it didn't matter who paid the money, so long as they could realize their crazy ambitions.
In the end, one of the tragedies of Bull was that he didn't understand that the technology to which he was tied, gun technology, had passed. The day had passed. He was very jealous of a development in the United States at Lawrence Livermore, where he knew that they were thinking of building a gun which would be capable of sending small payloads into space, particularly for use with the development of a space station.
The sharp, light gas gun at the Lawrence Livermore Labs in California uses compressed hydrogen to launch an 11-pound projectile to speeds nearing 9,000 miles an hour. A methane gas explosion propels a piston down a long pump tube to compress hydrogen to 30,000 pounds per square inch. The launch tube is connected to the pump tube at a right angle. Initially, it was thought that this would make it possible to pivot the launch tube to a vertical position, but the gun has yet to be pointed skyward. Still, it bears the acronym SHARP, which stands for Super High Altitude Research Project. With a space station in orbit, an inexpensive means of supply would be an attractive notion.
Suppose you forget some small piece of equipment or suddenly need it. How do you get it up there? If you send it up with a rocket, it costs huge sums. But if you could shoot it up with a gun, it costs almost nothing.
In the last quarter of the 20th century, conventional artillery has become smaller, not bigger. Dr. Bull's 155mm gun design is now standard in most of the armies of the world. What sets the guns of today apart is the super ammunition they fire. Smart ammunition incorporates sensors that seek out targets and ensure that virtually every shot is lethal. But the super guns of the next century may not fire any sort of projectile. Long the stuff of science fiction, energy and beam weapons are slowly becoming a reality. One of the most promising of these new projectile-less concepts is the electromagnetic pulse weapon, or EMP. The EMP is another byproduct of the nuclear age. It was discovered that a nuclear explosion produces a burst of electromagnetic energy which disrupts all electronic activity over a vast area.
If you can produce the pulse without the embarrassment of having to fire an atomic bomb, you have got a very, very effective weapon.
This pulse renders inoperable all electronic equipment in its range, disrupting transportation, communication, and computation.
And that's one of the things that the modern army in the 21st century is going to have to guard against, because everything these days is computer-driven.
There have been reports that the United States Army field-tested an electromagnetic pulse device during the 1991 Gulf War. Government sources will not confirm this. Because the consequences of the implementation of such a weapon system are staggering, the very existence of electromagnetic pulse weapons is shrouded in secrecy.
If the electromagnetic pulse weapon can be developed. You've put us back to the 19th century. We're back to rifles, bayonets, firing over open sights, sending messages by pencil and paper and runners and flags. If you take the electronics out of the modern battlefield, that's what you've got left. And this is a very frightening prospect, but it does mean that artillery will come back.
The quest to develop the next super gun will continue as it has since the dawn of artillery. Whether the super guns of tomorrow will be used for war or for more peaceful purposes is yet to be seen.
涛在成都同医务工作者以及有关方面的同志进行座谈时指出，各级党委和政府一定要以对人民群众极端负责的态度，坚决克服侥幸心理和松懈情绪，继续抓紧抓好非典型肺炎能力。
省地2级应设置传染病专科医院，产业确保经济稳步增长。
今年3月以来，陕西省旅游业餐饮
Located at southwestern frontier of China in Dehong, Dai, and Jingpo Autonomous Prefecture, Yunnan Province. It joins Myanmar on 3 sides, thus has long been the gateway connecting Yunnan.
Four tablets, twice a day, okay?
多谢总统大人带病接受我们《时报》的独家专访。
既然。
整座工厂也立即陷入了火海当中。你看到画面当中，浓烟密布，而整个火势相当的大。由于储油槽不时传出了爆炸声，因此呢，消防人员根本不敢靠近，他们只能让储油槽烧完之后再来进行灭火。而这场大火就这样延烧了将近7个小时才被控制住。还要来看摇头族竟然在民宅里就大开摇头派对，警方赶到现场的时候，他们还浑然不觉。远警当场搜出了1600多颗的摇头丸，并且带回6南水库的大输水管。桃园县长朱立伦下午就视察整个工程的进度，他强调在9月3号会顺利的达到分区供水。另外，他也宣布开放地下水源的使用，这不受法令的限制。晚间 TVBS 独家消息，经济部长何美月在晚间，他在水利署长的陪同之下，前往石门水库来巡视。他强调的是，星期五晚间供水的承诺绝对不会跳票。
从全国各地被征召来的焊工正漏夜进行钢架的焊接工作，每个人汗流浃背，有的甚至一天只睡2-3个小时。虽然累，但个个咬紧牙关，只为了让桃园地区的缺水问题尽早解决。
昨天晚上3点下班，3点多下班，然后今天早上5点多又被叫起来了，他中间只睡2-3个小时啊。
而经济部长何美月晚间也抱病来到石门水库，并且在水利署长陈生贤的陪同下，了解紧急工程抽水站的架设进度。水利署长表示，钢架的架设关系到导水管工程能否顺利进行，因此今天晚上是个关键。
最重要就是土建的部分，那个焊接的强度、结构的强度，然后吊的顺利。所以今天晚上大概到12点左右，这个要把它吊进去。那如果说这个顺利的话，那完工就比较会有信心。
何美月强调，南桃园星期五晚间供水的承诺绝对不允许跳票。
当然不能跳票啊！所有的
胡琴鲍尔在内的数十国代表团与会，为防恐怖攻击，机场旁就有武装警察在直升机待命，还一路由空中护送陈总统到达下榻旅馆。空中的紧张气氛和侨胞的热情形成强烈对比，即使是外国小孩都知道他是谁。
希望
前边，转前边。
而这些挥着国旗和民进党旗的侨胞，更是从世界各地赶来巴拿马。
边也撞到，阮行啊到对啊到，嘿，阮一路该支持。
由于巴拿马位在太平洋和大西洋的枢纽，运河庞大的经济影响力是台湾最重要的友邦，也是北京当局急于挖墙脚的对象。大陆驻巴拿马人员全程躲在一旁注意陈总统的一举一动，而卸任的莫兹科索总统对台湾非常友好。政党轮替上任的马丁总统对台态度更是政府要密切关注的。而陈总统除了与2位前后任总统晤谈愉快，更要推动中华民国在国际的正名运动。这一次随行记者在巴拿马所配发的采访证上面的国号都是 ROC 台湾，而且不仅如此，记者的新闻中心以及当地媒体所刊载的中华民国称号，通通都是统一为 ROC 台湾。这也显出陈总统这一趟的中美洲友邦访问，可以说是中华民国的正名之旅。我是张文明，摄影记者杨清波，我们在巴拿马的采访报道。
总统虽然目前他人在国外，不过呢，他也透露下一届监察院长人选，他认为国民党副主席。
But there were always doubts over its reliability, so to shut everyone up, Mazda entered a rotary engine car at Le Mans and in 1991 became the first Japanese marque to win.
But whilst the reliability of the engine may have been proven, there were still a few other drawbacks that prevented the rest of the world from running up the rotary path. Notably those emissions, but also poor fuel consumption and a lack of torque for low-down acceleration.
Yet I can forgive it all of that because of this, 9,500 revs. 2 models are available, a 190 bhp version that no one will want, and this one with a much more useful 230. Yet it still has less than 2/3 of the torque of the Nissan 350Z and does 6 miles to the gallon less than the 225 Audi TT.
Bizarrely, the higher-powered model has less torque than its baby brother, so it really does need the extra 2,000 revs and the extra 6-speed in the gearbox. In many ways, it's like Mazda's answer to Honda's VTEC. If you want some action, you need revs, revs, revs. So you're going to have to use the gearbox. But then, isn't that what real driving is all about? Of course, there are those who will bang on about how amazing it is for a 1.3-litre engine, but it isn't really, because it's a whole different concept. And in fact, when it recently won an award for engine design, it was entered into the 2.5 to 3-litre category. Good seat, good driving position, nice steering wheel and great dials. I really love that big rev counter in the middle with the digital speedometer neatly housed within it. In fact, generally interior has got sharp styling. I love this rotary centre console. But what on earth is that display all about? It reminds me of my first ever digital watch. Rear-wheel drive with traction control and option. The handling is very good, if somewhat on the soft side. In fact, it's more Audi than Nissan. But the steering feel is much better than the German opposition, and the gearbox one of the best. Well, the change is spoilt by a rather uncomfortable rotary-shaped knob and a handbrake that tends to get in the way. So it's safe and solid, but no MX-5 in the handling department. However, this RX-8 does have a lot more going for it. First of all, there's its looks. It's not as obviously pretty as an Audi TT, and admittedly it doesn't possess quite the same muscular road presence as a 350Z, but as an overall package, it works. Indeed, the longer I looked at it, the more I liked it. And for its pièce de résistance, the RX-8 has something that none of the other opposition have. Something that Rolls-Royce made a big fuss about with their new Phantom. Suicide doors. Doors that ease access to the rear seats. And when I say seats, I mean real seats. This coupe is a genuine 4-seater.
Added to that is the fact that at £22,000, it's something of a bargain. £5,000 cheaper than the equivalent Audi, but crucially only £2,000 less than the 350Z, which, unless you do have to carry your complete family with you everywhere you go, remains my pick of the coupe club. Still, time for one more rev.
In the black corner, the aerial atom.